afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those calling in from the West Coast. I'm Kate Kreamer, the Deputy Executive, and I'm on our webinar to discuss our newest major 50-state report, the State of Curriculum Education, an analysis of state Perkins V priorities. Please feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A at any time throughout. How we're going to run today's webinar is I'm going to run through major highlights from our report and then turn it over to our distinguished panel of peers and partners. We're going to respond to the findings and really just share their perceptions on what they've seen, what they're hearing, what they're observing about states' Perkins plans and the state of CTE going forward. All right, so before I dig into the report itself, I did just want to provide a little bit of framing of some of the biggest kind of shifts or opportunities that we saw within Perkins V. And those of you that attended our meetings, co-hosted with the groups represented on today's webinar, or have heard us talk about Perkins V, these should not be a surprise. And obviously there were, a lot was retained within Perkins IV, but in some of the biggest places we saw a shift or new opportunities for really moving the field forward kind of fall into these categories. First and foremost is stakeholder engagement and consultation that was required throughout the development of the plan to really inform key decisions about priorities for funding, priorities for where attention and time and resources should be directed, around performance indicators, the program quality indicator on the secondary side, even setting performance targets, kind of this new bargain to not just talk to those within the CTE field, but all of those that are both impact CTE and are impacted by CTE, so including the community-based organizations, learners, and other key organizations. Second one, which we'll be talking about today, I'm sure, throughout the webinar, is a focus on equity. This was a very big shift for Perkins V away from kind of Perkins IV and previous authorizations that really focus on gender equity, some attention to some populations, but under Perkins V really stepped up to put equity kind of throughout the plan, having a broadened list of special populations that needed to be attended to, of course, continuing to attend to gender, race, and ethnicity. States and locals are required to disaggregate and publicly report student level data across all those populations, as well as at the career cluster and program level. And then equity is a central element of the new comprehensive local needs assessment, and really a focus not just on identifying gaps, but what do you do to close those, as well as how do you actually recruit these populations into CTE that can benefit so greatly from it. The needs assessment, the new comprehensive local needs assessment, is probably what we consider to be the greatest opportunity under Perkins V to really kind of change the game of how CTE is developed, delivered, funded, really requiring locals, colleges, districts to kind of do a strategic plan for their CTE system, what's working, what's not working, and again, in consultation with those key partners within their community to really take that 360 view of how well their programs are aligning, how well their students are performing, and how they're attending to equity. And then really making sure whatever those findings are informs the local application, and then actually a requirement that the fundings need to address those opportunities, scale what's working, and then close those gaps. And then finally, we also saw a great opportunity around the expansion of middle grades, that Perkins V now allows funding down starting in grade 5, along with an expanded focus on career advisement. And this is just so important, also related to equity around providing those earlier opportunities for career exploration, for career development across grades and learner levels, and really build that pipeline and support learners while they're developing their occupational identities. So one more before I dig into the analysis, I did want to share a few quick caveats about the methodology and the overall analysis within this report. First of all, this report, unlike most of the other state of CTE reports that Advance CTE has put out in the past, is based on our analysis of state plans rather than a full 50-state survey that captures state directors and state CTE leaders' perspectives on policies and priorities. We did augment this analysis with a short supplemental survey, but the information found with this report is very much from the lens of Advance CTE, our staff, along with some of our partners at ACT, analysis of what we saw within those plans. Second of all, this report is a snapshot of state plans, which are living documents that can and should change over time. For example, we know that some states shifted state and local funding to support COVID over the summer, which does not represent our analysis, given that these plans were submitted in March at the beginning of the pandemic. And then finally, states, for those who have read Perkins plans, ESSA plans, WIOA plans, know that states put wildly different amounts of information in their state plans. Rather than try to analyze every initiative or policy mentioned, we chose to ensure that we have that consistent view and really could compare apples to apples, focus on the impact of Perkins, specifically around what are new programs, new initiatives, specific uses of Perkins funds, and the decisions about key elements of Perkins. So even though we got great information about the broader CTE ecosystem, we really tried to focus on what is the impact of this law. So with that, I'm excited to dig in. So as we went through the analysis and kind of going through the reams of information we derived out from the 50 state plans as well as DCs, we identified what we consider to be the hallmarks of a strong Perkins V plan. These were not identified at the beginning. This was not kind of the way the information we were seeking to find, but really kind of emerged as the story and where we saw kind of the most important investments, focus, and what kind of those look-fors are to make sure that really states are attending kind of collectively to CTE broadly. So first and foremost is a shared statewide vision that has a clear through line to the major decisions made in the state plan, including how states are directing funding and other key decisions throughout. Second are mechanisms for ongoing and meaningful alignment and collaboration across K-12, post-secondary, and workforce systems at both the state and local levels. Third is a commitment to equity, to the direction of resources, financial or otherwise, a focus on the needs of different populations of learner, and capacity building within CT systems to recruit and support learners and close opportunity gaps. Importantly, this is actually where we put career advisement and middle grades, because we see that as just so central to an equity strategy and really supporting each learner. Fourth is a commitment to quality, driven by support for programs of study and the expansion of meaningful work-based learning experiences, credentials of value, and dual enrollment articulation opportunities, which are essentially the three options states had for that secondary program quality indicator, which I'll speak to later. A comprehensive system to attract, retain, and develop CT instructors and other professionals who importantly reflect the demographic makeup of the learners they teach and the communities where they are teaching. Six is a commitment to data-driven decision-making supported by data quality, public reporting, and meaningful accountability indicators. And then finally, and this is the work ahead of us, is that strong system of supports to ensure fidelity implementation across districts and institutions. So what are some of our biggest findings? Starting kind of under vision, kind of one of another kind of opportunity that has been around under previous Perkins laws. Under Perkins V, it was a 10% was allowed that state agencies could hold back or reserve to reallocate to locals. That was up to 15% under Perkins V. And this is a clear place, kind of a clear lever that states can use to really demonstrate what they hope to accomplish and what their priorities are. So we actually saw that 46 states, or 90% of states, are using the reserve fund option, and 27% of them are using the full 15. So kind of it moved toward that expansion. A couple of other states kind of have a multi-year phase in to get to that full 15%. 35 states, about 2/3, are providing reserve funds, both secondary and post-secondary, either kind of jointly or one. And we're seeing at least 2/3 of states are planning to distribute at least some of their reserve funds competitively. So they have an option either to do so by formula or competitively. Some are doing both. But when you do it competitively, that really gives you more flexibility of what are those priorities that you want to be kind of seeding in the field, what are the innovation. So when we look at where states are most commonly directing the reserve fund, it's not a surprise supporting programs of study, the development, implementation, closing equity gaps. That's pretty exciting to see that 1/3 of states are using the reserve fund to address equity head on, expanding rural CT, and then expanding dual enrollment articulation to kind of round out the top selections. Around collaboration, interesting states, whether they pursue the option of a combined state plan with the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act or not, leverage a number of foundational commitments to support state level collaboration. For example, 90% of states are sharing labor market information across systems. About half of states are using common definitions of high skill, high wage, and in demand to send consistent signals to industry about what they're valuing, which pathways they're incentivizing, and in some cases, which pathways they're funding. We did see 80% of states are using either previously existing or new state level entities to encourage cross-sector collaboration. Some of these existed beforehand. The Texas Tri-Agency Partnership, for example, is an entity that pulls together kind of leadership from their education agency, their higher ed coordinating board, their workforce council, to have kind of conversations, and was key in developing their state plan. Other states built leadership teams kind of for the purpose of building a plan that they've decided to institutionalize because they saw such value in having that lever. 9 states did pursue the combined state plan option. That's up from 6 under Perkins 4. And those states, for those following along, Alabama, Delaware, Indiana, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Washington. Less common, I will say, among some of those states, they're kind of the blue bar. You can see in some cases they're a little bit more likely to engage in these activities. Approving common listed credentials of value, for example, you saw 44% versus 25%. Of interest is that, among the 2 states where the eligible agency is within the workforce system, which is Washington, Indiana, that might be putting the thumb on the scale for some of these, because those are, very often already kind of located within that part of the state system. In terms of how states were encouraging or incentivizing local collaboration, this, I would say, we see it as more of an innovation than kind of a common practice across the board. So 9 states are using the reserve funds to build regional pathways or regional models, either to advance pathways, work-based learning, where they're kind of jointly funding secondary, post-secondary workforce. Kentucky, for example, is requiring that secondary and post-secondary entities have to apply jointly for reserve funds. They're only funding them jointly. We saw about 1/3 of states are encouraging or requiring collaboration in the development of that comprehensive local needs assessment, although there is a minimum requirement that secondary is a stakeholder that needs to be involved in post-secondary needs assessment and vice versa. These states really went above and beyond, whether requiring sign-off by those partners of the plan or of their needs assessment. States like Colorado convened their secondary and post-secondary local recipients regionally to look at labor market information, identify some shared priorities, and then sent them back kind of to their institutions to actually then build out their full application and funding. And then interestingly, we do have 8 states that are not now requiring or encouraging consortium of secondary and post-secondary and sometimes workforce to actually receive Perkins funds kind of directly. Under Perkins 4, we had 1 example, Minnesota, and now Louisiana and New Mexico are joining Minnesota and kind of requiring all of their funding to go through this consortium model. But all of them have very different models of who's required to be involved, how the funds are distributed, what the priorities are. So in a few years, we'll have some really interesting kind of models to study and different approaches to really understand what are some new ways that we can be approaching kind of regionalization of CTE. Around equity, as I mentioned, this was a new and expanded focus in Perkins 5, and we're really excited that states absolutely took up the charge to focus on equity. That being said, the main focus was really on building capacity at the state and local levels to identify equity gaps. So the majority of states, as you can see kind of in the orange bar, are investing in technical assistance, professional development. They're directing state leadership dollars to support equity efforts. They're collaborating with other departments or agencies to coordinate services. So Ohio working with the Ohio Office of Exceptional Children. New York CTE is working with the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages to support English language learners. Montana is partnering with their homeless education coordinator and other representative special populations to really connect dots, share information, and think about where they can be better supporting learners in those programs, as well as getting more of those learners into CTE programs. And then about half of states are building out data tools or dashboards with surrogate data to give down to locals. So they don't have to do that work. They can spend more time actually analyzing the data and identifying those gaps. Where there's less focus is around actually closing those gaps or supporting specific populations of learners. While there are some great examples embedded throughout state plans, it's not surprising these are not overwhelmingly where states are moving, given this is just so new and such a new ground for us. With regards to career advisement, I mean, this is one where it was a strong priority and kind of present throughout the law, but was frankly a bit underdeveloped in many state Perkins 5 plans, particularly at the post-secondary level. Now, this isn't to say that efforts aren't happening across states around career development, and we know that they are, but either they're not supported through Perkins dollars, or not being advanced as part of kind of the Perkins or CT system, or might just be happening kind of in parallel. This is again a place to kind of probably more research unpacking to understand where that disconnect is. Career advisement is largely showing up with the needs assessment where there's intentional focus there. Some states are directing leadership funds, but you can see that in 1/4 of states, post-secondary advisement isn't even mentioned in plans, let alone kind of having that influence of Perkins. On the other hand, we did see middle grades really be a place where our states are leaning in. This was actually information gathered from our supplemental survey, but found that 90% of states are allowing middle Perkins funds to be used for middle grades, about half of which starting in grade 5. However, about 1/3 of states actually did not require or did not include any details in their state plans about how they're supporting middle grades. Essentially, they left that choice up to local districts of if and how and in what ways they might be supporting middle grades. We did see, not on this slide, we did see quite a few states kind of have a middle grade as a focus of the needs assessment, local application. We saw the development of some instructional materials in a handful of states, but this was one where I think states said, we're going to let the money flow that way, but really give that authority and kind of decision making to local level if that really fit into a priority for them. Around quality, there's obviously so much we can cover under quality. I mean, this is just, you know, every element of a high quality program. We really focus on quality through the lens of programs of study, and then those three options for the secondary program quality indicator: work-based learning, credentials, and dual enrollment articulation. With regards to programs of study, and this again comes from our supplemental survey of state directors, we found that about 3/4 of states are going above and beyond the minimum required one program of study for local recipients. And 1/4 of states are actually directing all of their state and Perkins dollars to support programs of study. This is great progress, but we know we have a long way to go. We still are seeing 1/4 of states are still only requiring that minimum. We obviously love to see that that bar raised even higher. And so we still have a long way to go to ensure that all programs are robust, aligned to labor market demand, provide seamless pathways across secondary and post-secondary, or anchored in credential value. With regards to those three other indicator or three kind of other aspects of a quality program, there's a lot here. Just to kind of draw some attention where we think kind of the most interesting, there's movement, but potential more progress, is that about half of states, give or take, are including one or all of these elements within their program approval requirements. Interesting analysis to get a sense of, are those required for program approval, and are they the same one that the state chose for a program quality indicator, to make sure those connections are being reinforced. In some states, yes, in some states, no. We did see in about half of states, only 1/4 for credentials, did prioritize within their needs assessment or local application requirements and templates, and then less so, but where that innovation and really kind of where you can be putting their thumb on the scale is that we did see use of reserve funds for 20% for work-based learning, about 1/4 for dual enrollment, articulation, and then just 5 states really use their reserve fund to support either credential attainment or developing kind of new lists. With around recruiting, retaining, and supporting instructors was also a key focus of Perkins V, with the expectation that it would be a priority at both the state and local level. Generally, it's no surprise that states are focusing most on providing targeted professional development to kind of specific groups of educators, such as new CTE, and a number of states have new CTE kind of boot camps or year-long professional development programs for new teachers or new administrators. And we did see about half of states put additional questions or expectations within their needs assessment templates to ensure locals attended this critical part of any CTE program. This was one of the required elements to really focus on this recruitment, retention, and supporting of teachers. But like I said, these half of states really put a lot more intention or kind of specifics above and beyond kind of the minimum requirements. Among the other responses, we did see at least 7 states addressing licensure barriers or kind of are developing new pathways to licensure to really strengthen that CTE pipeline of instructors. However, one place where we kind of think there's definitely room for more focus and attention is that only 5 states actually had explicit recruitment activities that focused on diversifying the field or focused on demographically diversifying the field. There was a lot of talk about we want to diversify the pipeline and create more pipeline options, a lot less attention on making sure that you're recruiting those instructors that reflect the demographics of the learners and the communities in which they're teaching. All right, moving along into our last section on data-driven decision-making. As I mentioned, we saw that states largely taking accountability pretty seriously to drive quality, particularly the secondary level, where there were simply more options for states to take up. States were given a choice between 3 indicators I've mentioned a couple of times. They had to choose a minimum of 1, but could choose more. There's a new requirement under Perkins V. A little over half of states chose work-based learning, 43% chose recognized post-secondary credential attainment, and 1/4 chose post-secondary credit attainment. Interestingly, about 19 states, or about 1/3 of states, chose more than 1 indicator, with 4 states actually choosing all 3. You'll see that 8 states chose technical skill assessment. These are end of course or end of program assessments that measure kind of the standards or competencies within a CT course or program. And these are states that largely had robust technical skill assessments systems in place and wanted to continue to kind of prioritize and incentivize those. 4 states chose program completion to incentivize not just hitting the concentrator, but really completing that program goal all the way through. And then among the 7 states that chose other, kind of 3 of them, Rhode Island, Tennessee, and Utah, actually included their measure of school quality and student success from the Every Student Succeeds Act to really strengthen alignment across systems. That being said, one critical note is that the majority of states do not provide clear or meaningful definitions for their indicators within their plans. This will need to happen through the development of business rules or guidance for locals, but it is certainly a place where more attention is needed to ensure that the indicators are really measuring quality experiences and outcomes. With kind of another place, as some of you or all of you may know, Perkins V moved towards a new definition of a secondary CT concentrator. This is critical because it serves as the denominator for all secondary level indicators. However, this attempt to build a more comparable definition was actually resulted in less rigorous than what a number of states had in place under Perkins IV for their definition. So as a way of being bold, as we like to say, we saw about 1/3 of states develop their own distinct definition that very much aligns with the law, but provides that context and specificity. Of greatest interest are those 10 states that specify that a concentrator must take at least an intermediate or advanced course to ensure they're engaging in that higher level, more rigorous content. California actually aligned their CT concentrator definition with their statewide CT completer definition because that's used within their statewide accountability system. And then finally, I just want to share kind of the last, where we saw a lot less activity was around improving data quality. About 22% of states didn't specify any investments to do so. As mentioned earlier, we are seeing some states build out new dashboards or tools, both for around student level data as well as labor market information, and some technical assistant professional development to support data capacity and literacy at the local level. But given our last State of CTE report found that 86% of state directors believe improving their CTE data systems is a priority, and only about 45% think they have the information they need to make decisions about CTE, this is a place where obviously more focus and attention is needed. May just not be happening through Perkins, it's happening through other means, through other investments, but something that we look for and didn't see as much within state plans. So before I turn over to the panel for their reactions, I just want to share a few other resources that we have or are putting out to supplement this report. Hopefully you've seen some of them. One is New Leaders redesigned state pages that are drawing on national and state specific data along with some Perkins decisions. This is Florida's page. We have a new comparison tool where you can compare and download data from across states on Perkins and other major state level policies and decisions. And we have a series of short videos featuring state CT directors on key innovations and areas of focus in their state plans. We currently have videos from 3 states, Rhode Island, Oregon, and Maryland up, but we'll be adding more in the coming days. We'll also release some fact sheets and mini briefs to further unpack the data and better understand how states are going about implementation. My last minute before I turn over the panel, I do want to just thank the rest of the Advance CTE team. This was a truly team-wide effort that has been spanning months, in some ways years, across our team as well as our partners from ACTE. So many were involved in the review of the plans, writing and reviewing the report, developing those new web pages and the tools, building out the communications assets. So I just want to thank the entire team because we could not have done this without you. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our panel of key experts and partners. You may recognize, hopefully you recognize all of these names. They have been our partners throughout kind of our Perkins implementation since in some cases, in Alisha's case, certainly throughout the actual writing and reauthorization of the plan. And then once we launch our implementation supports, working with Ben and the rest of the NATE team and Jim from AACC to do our implementation meetings, our expert peer review, joining a number of our work groups. So I'm really excited to turn it over to them and kind of hear from their thoughts on what we presented and what else they're seeing. So I am going to stop sharing and we're going to get into it. All right, well, I'm going to open this one up. Anyone who wants to go first. I'm curious, as you think about what I just presented, what you've read, what you've been hearing, what most excites you or surprised you about the findings from across Perkins 5 priorities?
Well, Kate, I can jump in and say, I think what most excites me is kind of what you just shared, the collaborative nature of many of these plans, how from the very beginning, states brought together diverse teams of people across agencies, multiple partners, and really carried that through. And we saw it materialize in the actual content of the plans with that built-in feedback loops and opportunities for cross-state data sharing and different initiatives that they were pulling together under the umbrella of their Perkins CTE state plan. And I think stakeholder engagement that you mentioned as a key new opportunity was really epitomized in what we saw kind of come through the planning process and then hopefully the implementation process of the plans going forward.
I think for me, one of the most exciting aspects was a continued and increased, seemingly increased emphasis on work-based learning, really strong in a number of ways. As the report points out, maybe a little bit of room for growth in terms of, not only emphasizing it, but also building it into your accountability and all that, although it was the leading secondary program quality indicator that was chosen, which is good to see. I'm obviously a little bit worried about that at the same time, given that, the timing of when these plans were turned in and what's happened since. And it's interesting that we probably have maybe not 180 degrees, but have sort of switched from a emphasis on doing as much things in person rather than virtual to emphasizing what we can do virtually in terms of work-based learning, in the last several months. The Texas model that's highlighted in the report I thought was really interesting in that regard. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of the same things can be said in terms of the emphasis on post-secondary credentials of value as well. I think there's a real need to do that in a coordinated fashion moving forward. And North Carolina is doing some interesting things there. But those are two things that appealed to me.
And then I would just piggyback and just want to say I'm delighted to be with you all again. It's incredible how far we've all come in the last couple of years. And I'm really excited about the transformation of really how we look at equity in career technical education. And I think back to the conversations we had back in fall of 2018 as we were talking about the incredible opportunities we have within these new equity provisions within Perkins V. And it's exciting to see those being realized, whether it's recognizing the need for reliable data to perform equity gap analysis, the critical need for disaggregated data. But as Kate just said a minute ago, it's so critical for us to have quality data to do that. So let's keep pushing for that. The emphasis on root cause analysis, which is something we have found to be critically important. And I know Washington, D.C., for example, is highlighted in the report. Targeted technical assistance and professional development for capacity building to really build the tools that people use to do meaningful work. And then utilizing resources for professional development, including the reserve fund and other types of levers that we can use. And then really that, just to piggyback Alisha's comment about collaboration, that critical collaboration across secondary to post-secondary, industry, workforce systems, and community. And I think one of the things that I'd like to remind us of is the resources we have within the communities that already exist. So where are there nonprofits? Where are there organizations within communities that already have those relationships? So you're not starting from scratch, right? Where you have that authentic reciprocal relationship already there, to really engage folks in a deeper look at how to realize the vision of these plans, especially in the context of everything that's happened in the last 8 months, where, had we had this conversation in February, we would be approaching it totally differently. And so we have to have the kind of flexibility that the report talks about, but really be intentional about engaging the community, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. So, and then the last thing I would say, I think we have a real opportunity to be very intentional around goals and objectives, both formative, so in terms of process and outcomes, and measuring whether we're getting the desired effect we want in moving the needle.
Well, I will want to just say thanks, Kate, for your leadership in writing this report. I have said internally on our staff that I'm now officially passing the baton to Kate to being the Advance CTE Perkins expert. So thanks for your leadership. I guess so as not to duplicate anything that anybody else has already said, because I agree with all of that. One was, I was happy to see states not follow the state plan guide and write a state plan that didn't follow that actually had a theory of action and was clear to follow through that. And you saw those plans that approached it in the permissive way that the Department of Ed gave allowance to you saw the cohesiveness in a different way than if you had to follow kind of just answering the questions in that order that the state plan guide laid out. The second was that I was surprised and excited about how many states picked more than one secondary quality indicator. I mean, frankly, when Alisha and I were in the room working on this part of the law, never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that any state would do more than one because of the lift. And so I thought that spoke to the commitment of the field and even willingness to add a secondary quality indicator when you don't know how you're going to measure it. I mean, to me, that is, there's the upside and the downside to that, but it spoke to the commitment that people are wanting to make to move in that direction. And the last one that I would say, and this is, I think many of my pluses are also areas of more work, is the comprehensive needs assessment, local needs assessment is perhaps, I mean, in my mind, the most powerful policy tool and mechanism in the law if done right. And I think states took that really seriously. I mean, there's no question that we can improve upon it. But, we saw lots of different models get incubated, which I think is the beauty of Perkins, of allowing a lot of flexibility for how you go about designing it. And I'm particularly intrigued by the states that looked at the approach of regionalizing the comprehensive needs assessments and trying to kind of move the work forward in that way. So I'll stop there.
Great. I mean, that's so much there. I also, I mean, like, amen to all of that. The accountability was very surprising. I also, the fact that I know this one that was put out there as kind of a floater, but that 10 states were willing to reconfigure their concentrator definition to say, like, intro is not enough. We really want to put, and we had, I think 1 or 2 states had that before and saw that. And I would imagine I could see more states moving that direction because many states just took the default definition, but now they have to operationalize it through those business rules. The decisions can continue, right? This was not a decision that needed to be instituted. These are living documents. And that's the kind of thing that can be evolved. So states listening, you can continue to raise the bar throughout. So I'm going to ask the flip side question. That was what excited you. Where do you feel like you kind of wish there was a little bit, to use Kim's favorite term, a little bit more boldness? Like, where do you feel like steps could or should have stepped up a little bit more? Or framing it nicely, can be stepping up going forward as they move into implementation of these plans.
Opportunity. Where's the
opportunity? Exactly. Hi, Ben, you want to start? Great.
Sure. So on page 16 in the ongoing and meaningful alignment and collaboration section, there's a comment that only 43% or 20 states have systems that support ongoing feedback loops with families, learners, and community members. And I think one of the things that we can all really look more deeply at is authentic amplification of student voice and community engagement. And I think it's particularly important right now in looking at the effects of the total interruption of COVID-19 on education, limited access or spotty access to technology, high-speed internet, the challenges of being able to do CTE through hybrid and online learning, all those types of things. But what's been really exciting is I know each of our organizations has benefited from support through ECMC Foundation, and our ECMC Foundation funded work is with 10 states in what's called the Equity Leadership Academy. And one of the things that we've been doing has been really exciting is engaging students as part of those teams. And if we learned so much from that process and want to share some of that wisdom with you all to see if you can replicate that in your states. But one of the things we've done recently is actually have students that are from each of those teams lead one of the technical assistance calls and really help to identify some of the best practices to authentically engage students. And so having them guide and lead some of those conversations to talk about their own stories and experiences. And I just want to give one example of a story that was really powerful where a student shared how he had experienced institutionalized racism within his institution and how it had affected him as a person, as a learner, and as a member of that community. That then led to state leaders within that team actually being able to work with that institution to address those issues. So that student felt validated, felt valued, and saw that change could come about. And so, you know, a student even as recent as this week said, this is the first space where they feel that they are a part of the system rather than kind of being subjected to the system. So I would really encourage us to think about how we can authentically engage students and then elevate their voice and their narrative.
I'm so glad you pointed out that finding, because I just, so much data, so little time to get through all of it, but it's definitely one we've been talking about a lot, is that there's a ton of mechanisms to get input from the family, from the CTE practitioners, but what are those ongoing mechanisms for stakeholders, the family, the community, the other kind of special population like representatives? So thank you for pulling that out, because I think that is definitely a place that we're focusing, and I know you are intently. Why don't we go to Jim next? I'm gonna start to call him
Yeah,
out.
for me, that area, you know, looking at it, as Kim said, positively, where there's room for growth, perhaps, that was in the area for me of what the report calls structural decisions. And regarding specifically to, you know, decisions about the eligible agency, decisions about the secondary, post-secondary split. And I'm not even saying that necessarily things should have come out differently with regard to either of those things, but in terms of what the report put forward and the state plans that I had the opportunity to read, I just didn't get the sense, at least on paper, that there was, you know, that states were taking as much opportunity to really revisit those issues that doing this new state plan gave them, and really examining, you know, the reasons that they do things the way they do in those areas. And you know, perhaps in some places, what it wound up being is what we sort of talked about and warned against in the meetings over the plans, was that we're doing it this way because it's the same way that we've always done it. I know in one way, it's no surprise you're hearing from the community college guy complaining about this state splits again, but I'm really not complaining about the outcome. I'm more talking about you know, the thought process going into it. And you know, and the other thing I just say about that is, like, the one, you know, reason that I saw kind of put forward with regard to the split was largely based on enrollment, which of course is a major factor that you want to take into account. But there are a lot of other things that seem to that should go into that decision, and I just didn't see a lot of that, you know, either as presented in the report or in the plans that I had the opportunity to see.
Great. Why don't we go to Kim next then, in terms of
Sorry, I was putting in the chat that people should look at West Virginia on the funding, but I'm not going to tell anybody what the innovation is, because then they have to see the innovation in the report. So, all right, so where do I begin? To the upside of equity, the downside is lack of clarity about what to do about equity. Specifically, very few call outs about racial equity, which I want to think for all of us. I mean, given that these plans were kind of written, you know, largely the end of last year, I think if we had written the plans now, they probably would look a lot different. But I think that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to call that out and the work that needs to be done there in all of education, but particularly in CTE. Two was, I was disappointed of not seeing much about program quality. I mean, yes, we had definitions around size, scope, and quality. And yes, we had some states making progress on programs of study, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I feel like we kind of like passed over that because it was kind of like foundational, like, yeah, we're doing that. But like, I think there's still a moment there in the plan to really focus on that, particularly through the reserve fund, although some states are talking about innovations and programs of study around the reserve fund. The last two that I've got is as the report speaks to this notion of coherence, of you make a decision about what your secondary quality indicator is, but you don't see it in your needs assessment. You don't see it in your state size, scope, and quality definition. And so kind of that alignment, the through line of decisions through state plans. You saw that, in my opinion, more in state plans that didn't follow the state plan guide. It was harder to pick apart when people followed the state plan guide. So I don't know if it was just harder to see it and the intentionality was there, but that was hard. And the last one, which I'm not going to necessarily say is the fault of states, but single digit performance targets. On the one hand, I understand the false incentives, because Alisha and I fought against this in the way that the accountability section is structured and the fact that we don't have good systems for collecting data. But I would have hoped that we kind of would have held ourselves to a little bit of a higher push on that. So those are mine.
Alisha, you wanna finish it out?
Sure, and much like Kim last time, I could say ditto to everything that other folks have had, especially the details of operationalizing some of these decisions, like Kim and Ben and Jim all mentioned, on equity. How are we going to address those things, and what are the next steps? But the one other area I'd like to highlight is the teacher pipeline. We saw a lot, as Kate mentioned when she did the overview on professional development, which tends to be where a lot of Perkins resources and Perkins plan content is focused historically, but not nearly as many states really digging in on how we're going to solve the teacher shortage in CTE. And that's definitely an issue that every state and local leader we talk to says is top priority, but we didn't see that come through as clearly in the plans as I might have liked to see. Particularly, as you mentioned, on the diversity of the pipeline, which is really essential to solving the teacher shortage in general. You can't do that without recruiting diverse populations, and also then carries over to the equity work more broadly about being able to have students see themselves in their educators. So that's a place I think we as a field have a lot more work to do that maybe wasn't articulated as much in these plans as we would have liked.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll just add one more that I think is another missed opportunity, even though I'm technically just the moderator at this point, and I didn't include any on the set-asides. I mean, I think we saw for the non-trad gender set-aside, kind of keeping going what you're doing, kind of states, fell in that range between kind of the minimum, maximum. The state institution set aside, I think we saw quite a few states actually go up to the full 2% or go above 1% and put more details than we've seen in the past of how they're going to be partnering or supporting programs purely within correctional and juvenile justice institution. The new set aside for recruiting special populations, which was wonky and essentially gave states the option, particularly those not getting a huge distribution of funds, to put in 3 digits worth of resources, but only 4 states actually put in the full $50,000. And very few states put in any information. If you go to our state pages and comparison tool, we don't even have information on that set aside because like the details were still missing. And given we know communications, marketing, building that pipeline of learners is such a foundational and long-standing issue within CTE, it does feel like a missed opportunity that more states didn't kind of step up there.
And I would just add, I think on that, Kate, like you can't spend Perkins money on marketing because of Edgar rules other than that set aside.
Exactly.
So like if you want to do any marketing, like that's your place to do it. So
Correct.
So don't forget,
not really
you can change your decisions. You're
Right. I'm going to put a prompt. People have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm going to ask them potentially one more, but I don't see any questions yet, so hopefully the group will join in. So I want to ask one about, you've mentioned the comprehensive needs assessment. We've kind of, all of us at one point or another have identified this as one of the strongest levers in Perkins to address both quality and equity and disrupt the old ways that we've funded CTE. So do you feel like states fully embrace? I mean, Kim spoke this a little bit, but I want to unpack it, right? In terms of like, where do you feel like they stepped up? What do you maybe hope to see kind of in that mid-year 2? Because the majority of states kind of chose to go with the 2-year kind of process rather than kind of going more often. So what do you maybe hope to see? Where do you want states to lean in more? Or another question, like what do you hope to see as the outcome, right? Because we don't really know if it had the impact. We only kind of know what the process looked like. We don't yet really know what the outcomes are.
Well, I'll start on this one. So I guess what I would say is, I think people spend a lot of effort on building the assessment, right? And helping their locals go through the process. Now the work to be done is how do we make sure that the decisions and information, the gaps that are identified through that assessment are now aligned to where the money is being spent in the local application. So I think, it's the fidelity of implementation that is the work ahead. And I'm not sure that everybody really understood that those things were all supposed to come together, that the decision, that what you see in the needs assessment is supposed to show up in the local application and direct how you use that money. So I think there's a piece there. I mean, I think, we asked the state directors recently kind of, are you planning on changing your needs assessment? And we do know that there are some systematic improvements that can be made, like giving locals the data rather than locals having to generate their own data, streamlining the application and the needs assessment because there's a lot of redundancy. And so I feel pretty good that the field did a good job for the first time. I also think we know now where the improvements need to happen. And I would hope for more collaboration between secondary and post-secondary, as well as more alignment between the needs assessment and the size, scope, and quality definitions going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the field did embrace this as a major shift and really dug in and tried to figure out how to make it work best in their states and communities. But that doesn't mean we got it 100% right on the first try. And so there's still room for improvement. I think the other thing, when we wrote this language and when we went through implementation, we never anticipated this major intervening event like a global pandemic that would completely turn everybody's needs assessments upside down across the country. And many states did not spend a lot of time thinking about that revision process at the beginning because everybody thought we have 2 years to figure that out. Let's meet this first deadline and then consider that. In hindsight, that revision process probably needs to be a much more integral part of the whole needs assessment apparatus, because while hopefully we won't have another event that impacts the entire country in the same way, local communities face shifts in their labor market and their student populations, through industry changes or natural disasters of their own, all the time. And so it may be that that 2-year update is not really appropriate as a standard for every school district and every community and technical college across the country. And so how that evolves over time, how those needs kind of can be updated in real time, I think is something we need to think more about as well.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that both Kim and Alisha said. I mean, I almost feel a bit sheepish talking about, something that, places where opportunities weren't taken up, and it's something that's so new as the comprehensive local needs assessment. And totally agree with Kim's comments about, and both of you in terms of places have dug in, but they've been focusing on, how to build the thing and get it done. And then now it's time for implementation. I was encouraged. I think the report kind of looked at it in a slightly different way. I guess in this case, a glass is 32% full kind of guy, because I was encouraged to see that percentage of states were doing more than was required in terms of post-secondary collaboration through that. There were a number of other states I think that we didn't really know. So, the number could even be a little bit higher. Then I think that looking forward, the other kind of major area that, I would like to know more about, and the way it's being implemented, is really how the needs assessment is being used to really meet the needs of business and industry. Obviously a major purpose of it, but I think more needs to come out about that, and Alisha's comments in particular about how dramatically things have changed in that area over the last several months are particularly apt.
So what I would add to the puzzle of what we've been sharing, and I appreciate everything everyone has contributed so far, is what we're hearing from the states is a real need for capacity building to support the locals beyond the what, right? Beyond just here's the application, this is what you do, this is how it's used. It's so much more important to understand the why. Why is it so important for us to have meaningful disaggregated data that's aligned to programs of study leading to good jobs in the community, where you have disproportionality, whether you look through the lens of gender, race, ethnicity, special populations, or what we have to constantly push for is cross-tabulated data, right? So you were talking about the set-asides. The non-traditional occupational set-asides can be a really important lever to address gender equity gaps, and in particular, equity gaps for women of color who are disproportionately underrepresented in high skill, high wage, in demand pathways. So let's not only look at demographics monolithically, but really look across and push hard for that in the work that we're doing. And being able to have spaces where we can have meaningful and deep engaged conversations around this work is where the transformation will really happen.
Great, thank you. I think the why and the how, right? I mean, I think that's the how. How do we do this? So we have a question from Nick from Hawaii, who gave a nice shout out for his NAEP dashboard. So nice job, Ben. But the question is about really like decisions about how do you balance the programs, focusing on where to improve equity gaps. Do you focus on those to, the programs that can move the needle the most, kind of have the largest gains, or where there are programs where there's possible smaller, moderate gains, but more programs, right? So you kind of go all in on if we can fix this program or adjust this program or this gap, it'll have the largest impact, or kind of focus on more programs to close maybe smaller gaps. And any kind of thoughts on how to approach that?
Well, so, some initial thoughts, and I can get us started, is often a really good approach to take, especially if you're innovating, is a pilot approach, right? So you identify a specific institution or a specific set of programs and set specific short-term and longer-term goals and objectives and measure that progress, and then look at how that can inform a larger strategy that may touch other programs. And you could have multiple pilots going simultaneously, but that's a really good way to innovate without driving a huge number of resources forward before you've proved a concept, for example.
I guess I was going to say, as with many things, it depends, but I think that oftentimes it depends on the environment you're in. And so do you have are you in a state or in a community where you have to build will, so you need early wins in order to convince people to do the bigger lift? Or is the will there and people are ready to dig in? So I think that, to me, a lot of this is conditioned upon kind of what your stakeholder and political environment speaks to. And I would say your stakeholders will be a really important part of determining the urgency and where you most focus your efforts. I think that's the whole purpose of the stakeholder engagement part of the CLNA, is you don't have to make these decisions on your own, nor should you be.
I think the value of those pathways, the programs, whether industry, and then kind of balancing that against with, the often tension of which ones students are really engaged in. Are there ones where they're both really well aligned with industry needs, but there is some that just have greater value among you're actually serving? I think could be other considerations. All right, well, I'm going to ask one more question and then my last question. So I'm actually curious. We actually have a different question that I'm going to ask from a friend. So a question around what can be done to shift from compliance only to more continuous improvement and support, given that now obviously the focus is triaging around COVID response and kind of focusing more on compliance just to kind of keep things moving, because there isn't necessarily the time or capacity. And so kind of what recommendations or advice do you have there?
I think this is, we talked a little bit earlier about the room for growth in building more feedback loops into in terms of ongoing collaboration. I mean, states seem to have done a really good job of that initial collaboration, which is both compliance and improvement due to the requirements that were in the law. But it seems like that, and Ben was talking about this earlier, the necessity of those feedback loops with all the various stakeholders really is going to drive that process a lot. So I think that's one area where we talked about earlier in terms of room for growth that I would put into that context.
And I think, Kate, what you just mentioned about easy wins on the equity question is also applicable here. Are there things that states can do in the short term to continue to move their vision forward that require maybe slightly less resources and capacity than some of the other things do to keep that momentum going, so that when people are able to pivot back after things start to even out, that this work hasn't stopped, that it's continued, and that there are continued focus on equity and quality and the hallmarks of Perkins V and the state plans throughout this time.
And I would just build on, I would say, I think in a time of crisis, it forces you to commit to what are your non-negotiables. And also, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So we commit to, we're not going to waver on quality and equity. And if we're not going to waver on those, everything else is on the table in terms of the how, right? So I think this is a moment of, if you have the right leadership, allowing you to take advantage of the disruptive kind of innovation that can happen, of bringing things that are on the margins to the mainstream, because we have to be more efficient, because we don't have the tolerance of inequities, because we are, we have to pivot so that more people are engaged in the labor market. So I'm hopeful that people aren't just kind of hunkering down and holding out for the storm to pass, but jumping into the middle of the storm and taking the best advantage of it. So I'm sure nobody is surprised to hear me say that. I do have my Be Bold shirt, just like Scott did. So there you go. Thanks, Ashley, for asking the question. You allowed me to bring out my shirts.
So I would add that we also need to really reassure the locals. The folks like me a few years ago, I was a Perkins coordinator for 12 years at a community college. So letting folks know at the local level that it's not about compliance. That's not what they're going to be judged on. They're going to be judged on the degree to which they're really pushing the needle, as Kim has said. So ensuring that there is an understanding of what the priorities are, and then that there is a process for continuous improvement, utilizing data, engaging in root cause analysis, identifying those specific strategies, building in how you're going to measure whether what you're doing is having a desired effect, so that that then can become a continuous process. So great question. Ashley and Nick, thank you both.
Yeah. All right, well, we have 2 minutes left. So hopefully this will work as I prepped you all. I'm gonna ask, each of you has 30 seconds max to give one piece of advice to state leaders as they move forward, or I should say local leaders, with the implementation of their Perkins V plan. So let's start, Alisha, you're in my top corner.
Okay, so mine really piggybacks on the conversation we were just having, and that was to not lose sight of your overarching goals that you set in your state plan or local plan, or even, maybe they're not formalized there, but are underlying your work, because we know everybody's distracted right now and dealing with, one crisis after crisis after crisis in their states and communities, but keeping those goals at the forefront and moving toward them, even in small ways, is my advice right now.
Great, I'm gonna go to Ben next.
Did you say Ben next?
I did. I'm gonna do
okay, great.
So I'm gonna go by first name. So Ben.
No worries. No. So in the context of COVID-19, I think we need to focus on the critical need for equitable learning for students in CTE. What are the barriers to access and opportunity? But how can learning be differentiated? How can we be creative in the ways we provide learning, whether it's work-based learning, lab learning, class learning? How are we doing hybrid? And how can we ensure that the equity gaps are not exacerbated for students who are already being underserved? And I really want to highlight getting people to think about the difference between equality and equity. So equality is everybody gets the same thing, but equity is that everybody gets what they need to be successful. So how do we help recognize that some students need more support and some students need different support? And how can we be really intentional about that at the state and local level?
Great, thanks so much. All right, Jim.
Yeah, I guess I always hesitate to give advice to, to actual practitioners, but I think my advice would be, listen, to be as forward-looking as possible at this moment in time. And I know as a college community, we talk a lot about how we are prepared as institutions to help this country in this economic recovery from the pandemic, but there's still a lot of questions we don't know, and we need to be forward-looking about in terms of what exactly does that mean? How is this going to change the landscape in terms of jobs and industries and businesses and so forth? And obviously all those conversations are front and center in terms of the work that we're doing at both the secondary and the post-secondary levels in the CTE world. So I guess to say, I know that we're all very, very focused on our immediate needs and like we've been talking about, but to be as far, to kind of try to see out the other side and look and model what you're doing accordingly.
Great advice. All right, Kim, take us home.
I would just say, I already kind of said what I was going to say, which is don't take your foot off the gas, people. But I guess I would add to that to say that just remember that your state plan is a living document and that you didn't have to get it all right. And it's okay to say we need something different now and to make sure that you revise it. The worst thing that can happen is you operate under a set of rules that were in place 6 to 8 months ago, and now you need something different. So don't be afraid to say we got it wrong and we're going to try something new.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. I'm sorry we went a minute over. Thank you everyone who joined, who stuck around. A survey's gonna come up in a moment. We ask that you please complete it and give us some feedback. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and thanks again.